Because
Can you
Cambridge
hear me
is
in
a big
here?
glass production.
Is that good? Test? Okay. Okay. I just messed that up. All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Discovering History. This time with Wes Clarke, and I'll let him introduce, tell you more about himself and what he's talking about later. Also, welcome to everybody who's on our YouTube channel, either live streaming or watching it recorded later. We ended up with around 150 folks on the last video, so it's something that we started very small at the end of November, beginning of December, and boom, within 5 or 6 events, it's really grown. So thank you to the library for that. Obviously, our Discovering History series is a partnership with the Washington County Public Library, so they sponsor our speakers, and they also worked with us to purchase all of the equipment for the live streaming. Typically speaking, we have a speaker the first Friday of every month. That's going to change a little bit here because we have, when we have the opportunity to take advantage of some different speakers, I say let's go for it, and the library supports that as well. So today, of course, is Wes. Let me also mention so that Christy, I'm validated with Christy. We do not have any more tickets available for tonight's murder mystery, but we do for tomorrow. If you're interested in attending the murder mystery tomorrow, which is based on innovators, American innovators throughout time, you could purchase them at the front desk or online, only until about 4 or 5 o'clock because we have to give our numbers to the caterer. So you can still get those online if you would like. Back to the Discovering History. So next Friday, February 27th at noon here or on our YouTube channel, Andrew Richmond and Holly Davis are going to be talking about a new exhibit they put together for Decorative Arts Center of Ohio and Lancaster. Have any of you ever been there before? It's a free museum. And they have this great, it's a giant like mansion house. In sort of the basement exhibit areas right now, the former wife of, now it's out of my head, wife of the lieutenant governor, who was an artist. She went to each county in Ohio and created a painting of a landscape of something in their community. And then she went to schools and she had students do the same thing. So this doesn't have all 88 counties because there's not enough space there, but this does have some of them. But upstairs is this, it's called Heartland. It's Ohio's story in 250 objects. So Andrew and Holly are going to be here next Friday, the 27th, to talk about that. And again, it's Decorative Arts Center of Ohio, and Lancaster is a free museum.
And I'm going to interrupt to say that one of the 250 objects in that exhibit at Lancaster is a Nathaniel Clarke.
That's true, it is.
Jar.
I forgot about that.
That they borrowed from the castles.
I was there for the the special opening. It's really it's really well done. I think you'll enjoy it. And I was there with my sister and my 12-year-old nephew. He was totally enthralled with all of it. It includes things like a little stuffed mouse that went with John Glenn to outer space. Things of that nature. After that, in March, we do not have a Discovering History speaker for the first Friday because we are hosting Teaching American History, which is a program from Ashland University that is teacher training. And the only date they had available for us was the first Friday of March. And I said, that's fine, let's do it. So there's going to be about 20 different teachers here from, all over the place for training for that day. However, later in the month, Jan Adams will be here Friday, March 13th. The title of hers is Myths and Monuments, Allegorical Figures Influencing the Nation. We've had a lot of really interesting conversations about things, just sort of sidebar conversations, and I'm really excited about the talk for that. The following Wednesday, March 18th, is Stephanie Bonack. She's the Director of Education for the First Ladies Museum and Library in Canton. And she's coming to give a talk on the Gilded Age Gals, the First Ladies from 1877 to 1900. Stephanie's pretty great. If you were here a couple of years ago, she brought some of Jackie Kennedy's pillbox hats and things of that nature. I want to say it was almost 2 years ago, exactly. And then we go into April. So just keep paying attention to our website, to the emails that we send out if you signed up for them, to the library posts that they put out, to our social media. We just have a lot of great things coming up. And when I have the opportunity to pull somebody in and, it's just a few weeks' time, we try to do that and take advantage of that too. So I just took up too many of your minutes, but I will let you introduce yourself. I know you know this crowd, so without any further ado, thank you again all for being here and supporting us and supporting our programs and our mission. We appreciate you all very much.
Okay.
Wes Clarke.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I know we have an online audience, so hello to you folks out there too. I am Wesley Clarke, Wes Clarke, and the RPA after my name there stands for Registered Professional Archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist. That's what I've been doing for over 50 years. And I'm now on the staff of the Castle Museum. I've been there about 14, 15 years. And for a lot of that time, we've been conducting archaeology right there on the castle grounds. I'll be talking about that a little bit today. My presentation today it's a little more technical than it sometimes is when I talk about this, so I'm going to have to stay pretty close to my notes here. We are using the Nathaniel Clarke pottery, which was operating at the location where the castle is over on 4th Street. We are using the pottery, what we found in the ground, and documentary research we've done as kind of a jumping off point to talk about early commercial development and practices here in Marietta and in the wider region in the early 19th century. We're not going to try to cover the entire era of the Clarkes here. It's a really big story, and I can really only scratch the surface today. And it's a story that's still far from complete. There's still a lot more we don't know and want to know about the Clarkes, so we'll keep going with the research. The early settlement of the Ohio country and its economic development, again, this is a vast subject. This is a fantastic reference for that topic. If you really want to get into the weeds on this, this is a great book. I do have a handout in the back. You don't have to worry about writing this down or copying anything off the screen because I have a handout at the back that has several references and a website that you can just grab one of those and take with you if you want to go further with it. Now, we'll start by noting that the Clarkes made pottery here in Marietta for about 40 years, starting in 1808. And then I think the clay ran out where they were at here in Marietta, and they moved down to Parkersburg to a location down there that had lots and lots of clay. So they made pottery here about 40 years. They went to Parkersburg, made pottery for more than another 20 years. So their story is quite the success story in a business that was a pretty tough business, pottery business, very competitive. Lots of potters come and go in the history of pottery making. The Clarks managed to stick with it for over 60 years. So indeed, they must have been doing something right because many other potters in the region came and went during that period. Here we go. And I will just mention we have published some of the information that we've developed, some of our research, especially this one on the right that the arrow is pointing to, has a lot of information on the development of the pottery craft industry in the region. And again, the web location where you could go and download that if you want to is on that handout in the back. So you don't have to worry about trying to write that down. See if I get my, here we go. The Clarke pottery established in 1808 was one of the very first potteries in the state. But by 1810, just a couple years later, it was in a very competitive environment. We know there were 4 potteries operating in the area of Washington County. And these very early potteries are the root, the beginning of an industry in Ohio that became very important, a very big part of Ohio's economy. And between 1810 and 1820, there was really a proliferation of potteries in southern Ohio. Now, I think some of my labels here have moved a little bit as they've transferred to this screen, but I don't think I think it looks all right. There was a proliferation of potteries across southern Ohio, especially around the areas, excuse me, of high population. Over here in the area of Cincinnati, we had 2 of the highest production areas. Up here around Zanesville, another early population center, very high production. And then Washington County comes in 4th in the state in the amount of pottery being produced in this early period in 1820. So again, this is happening around the population centers. And as I mentioned, these early potteries are all the start of what became a very important industry in Ohio. Ohio has abundant clay resources. That includes shale, which is really just a hard form of clay. We have lots of shale too. And these early potteries were the start of this industry, which by the beginning of the 20th century, by about 1900, the clay industry in Ohio was the biggest in the United States. We were the biggest state producer of electrical products. Now, bear in mind, ceramic products are much more than pots and jars and things like that. There's lots of other things that get made out of ceramics, a lot of electronic components and things like that. Now, again, I'm on the staff at the Castle Museum, which is this large neo-Gothic or Gothic revival house that we think was built around 1855. We give tours of the house, and as I think all of you here today know, we have lots and lots of other programming. So check out our website and try to take advantage of that programming, if you will. But prior to the construction of the big fancy neo-Gothic house, this property, which consists of 2 big city lots, adjacent lots, this property was occupied by Nathaniel Clarke, the potter, and his family. They lived there and also produced pottery there. We know that both of those activities were happening right on this property. And since 2013, we've actually been excavating remains of the Clarke pottery operation on the grounds of the museum. We're doing this right in the yard of the museum. And we've been very pleased to discover that the preservation of these early 19th century remains is excellent. And most of this material is just a few inches deep in the ground, but still very well preserved. It was a surprise to me because of all the big houses and changes that have occurred in the area there. I really expected a lot more disturbance. And here are just some views of our archaeological excavations and some of the things we find. It's a very dense site. There's lots of material on it, which makes it very interesting to excavate. Now, much of the work that we've accomplished archaeologically over there has been with participants in 2 archaeology camps that we conduct each summer. And these camps are both for secondary students, middle school and high school age, and also adults. And these are just some of our groups that have come out to do that. Again, we've been doing this for 13, 14 years now. And these camps are a great opportunity to learn about archaeological techniques. We're excavating a real archaeological site, not a pretend site or a made-up site. By all means, if you have any interest in that kind of experience, come out to one of our camps in the summer, or some folks bring their grandkids to town for the week and have them predict. We've had kids from as far away as California come to visit Grandma and Grandpa in Marietta and do the camp, because it is kind of harder, especially for the middle school age students, to find an opportunity to do this. Now, with this field work, we've developed a huge amount of information, of material information about the Clarke operation, including the fact that they produced 2 kinds of pottery. They made this red earthenware, or what's commonly known as redware. And they also made the higher priced salt glazed stoneware. These were the 2 basic kinds of pottery that they made. They're very typical of the kind of pottery that was being made by these early potteries in the region. Nothing real too unusual about what the Clarkes made, although we found some unusual products that surprised us a little bit. But we also find objects from the Clarke household. And this is just some examples of some different kinds of objects. Really interesting one is the one in the upper left there. That is a pocket watch key to wind up a pocket watch. And I'm kind of guessing whoever lost that was kind of unhappy. You know, it's like, darn, I don't have the key. Maybe it was Nathaniel Clarke's watch key. I'm not sure. I have looked at the old store records in town, and in the early 1800s, the cost of buying a key like this was equivalent to about $5 today. So for about what we think of as $5 today, it could have been replaced. We even find musket balls sometimes and things like that. So some people get excited about gun-related parts and things, and we do find things like that also. Now, these are refined ceramics that were used in the Clarke household, and obviously they're just fragments. We almost never find an entire or nearly complete piece, but and these represent food preparation, storage, and service items that would have been used in the household. None of these ceramics were made here. Later in time, some ceramics like this were made in Ohio, but in this early 19th century period, nothing like this was being made in Ohio. These are probably all from England. And incredibly enough, the refined pottery industry in England was at such a massive scale and efficiency of production that they could make this ceramic in England, ship it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, then ship it inland to a distant place like Marietta, and still sell it cheaply enough in a Marietta store that the average person here could afford to actually buy it. So the other thing about ceramics like this, they're very good indicators of the economic status of the people living in a household. We can look at the ceramics they're using and get a very good idea of what level of economy they were existing at. And these ceramics here are very typical of an average, what we might call a middle class, or maybe we should call it a working class household. There's nothing real fancy. I mean, these look kind of fancy and pretty, some of them, but they're all fairly inexpensive ceramics. There's nothing very fancy or expensive here. The most expensive kind of pottery you find in this period usually, or ceramic, is porcelain. And over 13 or 14 years, we've only found 2 or 3 or 4 pieces, little fragments of porcelain. So I don't think they had much porcelain in the household, and that's because it was pretty expensive. So we have a solid and expanding material record for the Clarkes based on our archaeological work. But fortunately, we also have a lot of documentary sources from written documents and records. We don't have everything that we'd like to have. And again, as I said before, we don't know everything about the Clarkes that we'd like to know. We keep finding new pieces of information and even new documents fairly regularly. So that's exciting. And the great thing then about a site like this is we can combine both the archaeology, the material record from the ground, and the information from the documentary record, right? The documents. And that gives us a very powerful representation of what was happening at the site, even as we still have lots of questions. Here we go. Now, for a start, when we're looking at the documents, we know exactly when, excuse me, the Clarkes opened for business in Marietta because they put this ad in the local newspaper announcing it in February of 1808. And this ad, excuse me, you may not be able to read it, but it includes a declaration that, quote, there is now a large quantity of ware on hand, which he, Nathaniel, can with propriety recommend to be superior to any manufactured on this side of the mountain. Okay, so he's announcing pottery's open. We've got pots for sale, and it's the best this side of the Allegheny Mountains. You'll find no finer ceramics. So now, 2 years later, another guy came along, another potter, Isaac Davis, announcing the opening of his pottery here in Marietta in 1810. And guess what? He makes a declaration in his ad here announcing the opening. He says, he, Mr. Davis, will be found to possess claims upon their patronage to which few of the craft in this county have any just pretension, quote unquote. In other words, he's saying, I've got pots that you're not going to want to buy pottery from anybody else, right? And then he goes on to say, my pottery will prove more durable, cheaper, handsomer, and in every respect preferable to any manufactured in this state, unquote. So I think we're getting the idea potters, tended to really puff up their product and what they had. You see this over and over again in ads with these early potteries. But the point here, it's safe to say that there was a competitive environment for people, the potters here in Marietta, even if it was just a few potters that were here. Now, despite Davis's assertions that he was making the very best pottery and everybody was going to be beating a path to his doorway to buy his pottery, a year later, he's leaving town. And he puts an ad in the paper to announce that. And part of the purpose of the ad is to warn people not to accept promissory notes that he's issued, notes of debts he owes, that he says he's already paid off. But for some reason, he's got the idea that somebody's got some of these notes out there and they're still trying to pass them off as having value, that they haven't been paid off. I'm going to talk about promissory notes more in just a little bit. But so he's warning people, don't take any notes from me. And he also makes an interesting kind of revealing comment here that he's vowing in the future to only deal in cash. Okay, so that indicates to me that he's had a lot of trouble in the year he's been in Marietta. A lot of purchasing and acquisition of things you needed, like pots and other things, was done on a barter basis, not on a cash basis, because there was almost no cash around. And the fact that he says, I'm going to come back. I don't think he did come back. We have no evidence of that. But he's saying, I'm going to come back, and when I do, it's all going to be cash. So I think he had kind of a rough time. Again, he's only here a year. In the meantime, Nathaniel's been here 3 years, 2 or 3 years, and he's going to be here another 60 years. So, whoops. Now, here in Washington County, we are really blessed with a tremendous archive of written records preserved in places like the county courthouse, special collections at Marietta College. But there are also Marietta-related records at places like Columbus, Ohio, Yale University, Harvard Business School, among other places. Now, there is this archive up in Columbus at the Ohio History Center, the Backus Woodbridge Archive. And I think pretty much all of it is on microfilm at Marietta. Did you say, Linda? Okay, it may not be all of the paper that they have in Columbus, but there is a lot of it on microfilm here. Personally, when I'm doing research with original documents, I like to work with the original document. To me, it's much easier to read than sitting on a microfilm reader. And sometimes the microfilm starts to fade a little bit, things like that. But there is this incredible wealth of business records that's associated with what we'll call the Woodbridge store here in Marietta, which is more or less considered the first general store in the Northwest Territory. It was kind of the Sears and Roebuck, if you will, for Marietta and really the whole region in this early period. And we're fortunate that so many of their business records have survived and are available to research. Now, this store actually started with James Backus and William Kendall. They established the store right down here at the point, right? Muskingum River coming in here, Ohio River here. Store was right down here at what we call the point. And they set that store up in 1788. So right at the start of civilian arrival and occupation here. Again, it's considered the first store in the Northwest Territory. But very soon after that, within a year or so, Backus turned the operation of the store over to his brother-in-law, Dudley Woodbridge Sr. in 1789. And the Woodbridges were pretty much associated with the store and the running of the store after that. Dudley Woodbridge Jr. arrived in 1796 as a 17-year-old and immediately got very involved in running the store. Also, Dudley Sr.'s wife, Lucy Backus Woodbridge, was very adept in business and was also very involved in running the store. Now, they had branch stores out around the county, several out in the county, and they were also very active in supplying stores that were even farther out into the hinterlands, if you will, of this newly settled territory, and still very much in development as far as settlement went. Now, the so-called Indian Wars, the conflict with Native American groups in the region, restrained commercial development until 1795, when we had the Treaty of Greenville, and it kind of removed or reduced most of that conflict between the new settlers and the Native Americans, at least in our area here. And after that, quite a few general store type operations were opened in Marietta. I've just listed a few of the very earliest ones there. We still give Woodbridge, the Woodbridge store, pride of place up there at the top in red, because again, it's the first, quote unquote, in the territory, and also a very long-lived operation, operating at least into the late 1800s. Now, as far as lines of supply went, Wheeling, what's now West Virginia, was the nearest sub-regional hub of supply. This was a place where merchants like the Woodbridges would often go to get resupply for the stores here at Marietta. However, Pittsburgh was really the bigger, what we would call an entrepot, a bigger regional kind of distribution center. This is a transshipment location where goods brought in from the east are brought to Pittsburgh in pretty big quantities, stored in Pittsburgh, and then merchants from further west here would go to Pittsburgh and restock up there. Oh, and I want to mention, as far as the trip to Pittsburgh goes, typically Dudley Woodbridge Jr. would make 2 trips a year all the way to Philadelphia. He'd make an overland trip to Philadelphia, where he would acquire goods for his stores, and he'd usually acquire all or most of those on credit. He'd have 6 to 12 months to pay off the bill for the goods he got in Philadelphia. And of course, the idea was he'd bring them back to Marietta and his other stores here, sell goods, generate capital that he could then use to pay off the bill in Philadelphia. He'd get the goods lined up in Philadelphia. He would have them shipped to Pittsburgh overland by wagon. That took 3 or 4 weeks. Then they'd be stored at Pittsburgh until he got somebody to go up Pittsburgh by boat and load up the goods and bring them down to Marietta, which took a few more days. Go up and come back down the river. I'm also led to believe that most of the local goods that were gathered at Marietta and in the region and were to be sold back east, a lot of animal furs and skins, ginseng, things like that. A lot of corn that had been converted to whiskey or pigs or pork it was shipped downriver, down the Ohio to New Orleans. That a lot of the products flowing out of the region here went downstream by New Orleans and then ended up back east. They did not go up to Pittsburgh and then overland back east so much. All right. Now, although Nathaniel opened his pottery in 1808, we saw the announcement in the paper. We do find him in the Woodbridge records 5 months earlier, in October of 1807, making a purchase in the Woodbridge store. And I've just got a little quiz for you here. I've given you several choices here. What do you think was Nathaniel's first recorded purchase here? He went downtown, walked in the store and he bought something. Any ideas? Anybody want to? Yes, ma'am. Flour and whiskey. That'd make a heck of a coffee cake, wouldn't it? Anybody else want to take a guess? It's actually C. Maybe he was a teetotaler. I don't know, because there was a lot of liquor consumption in this early period. I mean, whiskey was almost consumed the way we consume water now, because the water tended to not be very safe, or very reliable as something to actually drink. So but he purchased tea and coffee. He paid $1 for the tea and coffee. $1 of that period, which probably translates to around $20 to $21 in value now. So, but anyway, I can't say this was the very, very first purchase. This is the first one I found so far in those early business records. But it's just kind of interesting to get that kind of detail. Also, we have records in the Woodbridge archive showing Woodbridge purchasing or acquiring pottery from Nathaniel very early on. This is in May of 1808, just a few months after he had officially opened the pottery. And he may well, I think, have just given Nathaniel a credit for the pottery he took. It was for $6.39. So chances are it was just a credit that Nathaniel had down there at the store, and he could purchase things, get things from the store against it. And of course, local merchants purchasing from local artist craftsmen like this help the craftspeople get established and develop their business. And of course, it made for a local source on these things instead of having to go to Wheeling or Pittsburgh to get pottery and things. Now, it's interesting that Nathaniel arrived to set up shop in 1807. You know, he was here in 1807 because something of great consequence to the national economy occurred that year, that same year, 1807. Anybody know what that was? Yes. Yes, very good, Jan. It's this thing called the Embargo Act of 1807, which was a rather draconian response by Congress to the seizure of U.S. ships and sailors that was occurring, seizure by both Britain and France. Now, why were Britain and France doing this? Because they were at war with each other. These are the Napoleonic Wars. And they were each seizing shipping that they felt was supplying the enemy. So the English are seizing ships they think are doing business with the French. The French are seizing ships and sailors that they think are doing business with England. So it's kind of a no-win situation. Also, some British sailors were leaving service on British ships and going in service on American ships. And so the British authorities considered them to be, aiding the enemy, the deserters to the British cause, and people who could be reclaimed also. But anyway, this was just wreaking havoc to a certain extent with American shipping. So the Embargo Act of 1807 was passed. It sought basically to cut off all foreign trade by American ships, not just with England, not just with France. It's just like, we're not going to ship anything overseas anymore, which that's pretty drastic. And it severely restricted foreign imports to the U.S., especially from Britain. And of course, this just isolated the American economy and American production from world markets and was a pretty severe, had a pretty severe impact on the American economy. Here you see huge dip in imports during this period and a huge dip in exports. So, you can't have that kind of a severe change and not, impact your economy in a very substantial way. This had a really severe impact in Marietta because one important business here was building ocean-going sailing vessels. And this pretty much put a stop to that business. And some people who'd been making a good living doing this in Marietta, basically, they were out of business. In fact, it's reported that things were so bad here economically during this period that the local streets were quote unquote empty, and the general mood in the community here was melancholy. And not surprisingly, the general impact on the gross domestic product nationally also took a big dip starting in this period. It got further extended by things like the War of 1812 and other things that happened. So it seems like Nathaniel picked a very inauspicious time to start a business here in Marietta, right? 1807, 1808. But in fact, he was probably somewhat insulated from these national and international events by the fact that he's making a very locally needed product, something that everybody needed, pots and pans and storage jars and things like that. He was making it pretty much with local materials, selling to a local market. So it probably did impact his business some, but I think he was fairly insulated. Now, the Embargo Act was tremendously unpopular because of all these economic impacts it was having on Americans, and was repealed just a couple years later in 1809. However, there were continuing economic downturns during the rest of the 1810s and 20s for a variety of reasons. I'll touch on a couple of those here in just a moment. The War of 1812, of which Ohio was a big participant, the Ohio region, provided a short period of regional prosperity, kind of a boost after this embargo episode, because there was a lot of military activity here in Ohio, and they were spending a lot of money in the region. So this kind of gave us a short economic boost in the region, but eventually that money went away. A bunch of banks had been set, or a number of banks had been set up because of that influx of currency in business into the region. And the banks were not well managed in those cases. And so you had continuing economic troubles and crashes because of a very kind of unmanaged, unregulated environment, economic environment at that time. We have evidence that the Clarkes were having some financial troubles through these periods because we see 2 or 3 sheriff sales posted for the Clarkes where they had debts that needed to be paid off, and apparently the only way they could raise the money to pay them off were to, the sheriff came in and enforced payment. Somebody had gone to court and said, Clarke owes me this money and he hasn't paid. He should have paid me by now. And the sheriff comes, and in this case, they were going to sell $100 worth of stone and earthenware, pottery, 2 rifle guns, and 1 silver watch. He lost the key, probably wasn't using it anyway, right? exactly. Like I said, he owed Alexander Creel some money, and it probably hadn't paid it anywhere near the time he promised to pay it. Creel went to the court, said, the guy owes me. The court said, you got to pay, and essentially sentenced the sheriff to set up the sale to pay off the debt. Pardon? $100 is a lot. Yes, yeah, that's quite a bit of money. I'm hoping sometime we'll be able to determine exactly what the debt was over. We have pretty good court records here, and I'm hoping we can find specifically what that was for. Now, here's a question that has been interesting to me as I've been doing this Clarke research, and that is, where in the overall economic development of this region we're in here does Clarke fit, as far as were we still in a frontier, pioneer level of development, or were we somewhere further along than that? And the answer, I think, is pretty important, because it definitely has implications both socially and economically to what's going on as the Clarkes were establishing this business and the kind of parameters they were operating within economically. There is a difference between the frontier and a place that's settled country. There is a difference both socially and economically. Now, for some people, the answer is obvious. They go, oh, Marietta on the frontier in 1807? Heck no, that's 4 years after Ohio became a state. So Ohio's not the frontier anymore, right? But I think it's a little more debatable than that, and I think some people will agree that it is still a frontier area. Now, here's a couple examples of how Ohio's economic development gets periodized, gets divvied up into different periods of development. And they're both kind of similar. They're not identical. And again, these are just two examples out of many different tables or listings like this that you could find. Both of these place Clarke, the beginning of the Clarke pottery, in an era they call Pioneer Era or Early Settlement and Frontier Era. This one says that goes into the early 1800s. This is a little more specific. It's got it going till 1825. So we look at something like this, our question is answered, right? It's Pioneer, Frontier Era. But again, I'm not sure. I think it's helpful to think a little more about how we define these terms and exactly what it means when we talk about the frontier. So what makes a place the frontier? How do we define that kind of situation in an area? And here are some aspects of socioeconomic development that change dramatically across regions and time periods and can help us think about this question, I think, about whether we are in the frontier or not and what that means. Now, the official Census Bureau designation of unsettled or frontier territory is land with population densities of less than 2 people per square mile. So very low population density is kind of how the federal government and its Census Bureau identify unsettled or pioneer frontier type areas. And I'm showing you a couple of the Census Bureau maps here for different historical periods. This is 1790. The colors are a little strange on the screen here, but basically this color here, which on the original map is kind of like a very light yellow, And this color here looks kind of pinkish. It's actually kind of a darker yellow. For our purposes, we're going to consider that the low density frontier type population areas. And this is in 1790 when Marietta was established, right? You know, just a couple years after Marietta was established. And I think we can see that the more densely populated areas of the United States at that time are very much back toward the east, not very much out in the beyond the Alleghenies at that point. Okay. Now, in 1800, there on the left, the generally settled area, which for our purposes, 6 people or more per square mile, covers a large swath of the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and stretches south into Georgia. And you see there are a few pockets of denser settlement. They aren't showing up real clearly, but there are a few out, I'm sorry, out here. One here, there's a real little one down here. There's one up here around Pittsburgh. This is Cincinnati, where Cincinnati will be, or yeah, Cincinnati's there, but it's not real large. It is one of the major urban areas of the region. This is Marietta in the red there. Now, by 1810, the denser populated areas have filled in a lot here, but Marietta is still in a gap of low population between this higher density around Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania and a higher population developing over here around Cincinnati, southwestern Ohio, and down into Kentucky and Tennessee. So Marietta really kind of lags in that first category of population density. Now, with regard to transportation, in 1807, there was only one overland roadway, and that was Zane's Trace. And it had only recently been made passable for wagons. Up until a few years before this, it was still pretty much almost a foot and horse trail, not really very passable for wagons. Otherwise, except for Zane's Trace, running this way, and of course, totally bypassing Marietta. You just had foot trails and the waterways for getting around. Very, very little transportation infrastructure on the interior. The National Road, which you see crossing the state from Wheeling that way, that was really the first interstate highway, federal interstate highway in America. That would open up a lot of territory and connection back to the east, but that wouldn't be starting to construct it until a couple decades later. So that certainly doesn't really impact this early period we're talking about. So in 1807, river travel was the main way for getting around and transporting cargo. And locomotion on the river in 1807 was by just using the current to move your boat, or wind. Sails were used, or human-powered rowing or poling. And it's reported that a trip could be made from Marietta to the Cleveland area up on Lake Erie. You could do that mostly by water, but it was about a 300-mile trip. And you'd have to go up the Muskingum and into the Muskingum headwaters. So you're really talking traveling by canoe, a big cargo canoe or something like that. Then you have to portage across some land in the headwaters of the Muskingum to get to the headwaters of the Cuyahoga River and then go down the river to Cleveland. So you could do all that, you could get there, but it was pretty difficult and took a lot of time and effort. By the way, we do know that Nathaniel Clarke, at least by 1820, owned a keel boat. He owned his own keel boat, which he hired out to haul cargo. So we see the Clarks getting into kind of other lines of business related probably to the pottery. He might have used that keel boat to bring in supplies he could use for pottery making, special clays or salt and things like that he needed for pottery making. And he might have even loaded up his keel boat with some of his pottery and gone up and down the Muskingum or the Ohio to sell some of his pottery. But he did have a keel boat and took advantage of that form of transport in this early period. Now, of course, we did have steam-powered water transport that came along some years later, and that very much improved the speed and cargo capacity of moving a product and cargo around. But this wouldn't become a substantial way to move cargo in our region for some time, well after Nathaniel set up his pottery in 1807. By around 1819, it's reported there were about 60 steamboats operating on the entire Ohio River. So, there were a fair number of boats by 1819, 1820, but it was still somewhat limited. The first steamboat built in Washington County was called the Mechanic. It was launched in 1823. And guess what? Nathaniel Clarke was one of the co-owners of that steamboat. So again, we're seeing him get involved in some other businesses. I think we could very much call him an entrepreneur. Now, because we've got those great Woodbridge store records that have been preserved, we can get some great detailed information like this about some of the commercial activity in the region. We can see that it cost to take two boats up the Wheeling to load with cargo and bring it back to Marietta. The total cost of this trip was $99.33. And we got a very nice budget laid out here for the kinds of supplies it took to do that. You've got things like the provisions, which included pork, bacon, and flour to feed the crew, a crew of 6 for 10 days. You could hire the crew of 6 for 10 days for $50, right? You've got 4 gallons of whiskey. Whiskey was always a very important part of planning any project. If you were building a house or a business structure, or pretty much any other activity where you were hiring somebody to do some of the labor, whiskey would be a part of your budget to do that. But again, 10-day trip, 6 people involved in the trip, and all these supplies, it came to $99.33. This is in 1802. That roughly translates into about $3,000 in current money. So we're talking a substantial investment to get the 2 boatloads of cargo down to Marietta. Now, however, and this is from Wheeling, if you look at what it takes to bring a big load of cargo in from Wheeling now, we do that with a semi-truck probably, right? And from what I could tell online, you can get a semi-truck to haul a load down here to Marietta from Wheeling for $600 or $700. Is what I'm understanding from what I could determine online. So, there's been a big change in the efficiency, right, and the related cost. But Yes. I noticed. I, I, the way I kind of, that's the way I interpret it, that they're mainly getting one main meal a day. And the fact that it's only 9 for a 10-day trip probably means they didn't get the meal either on the day they left or the day they came back. Probably, well, we're back on the 10th day, but we're not feeding you anymore. Now, and then they would have probably had their own jerky, or dried salted pork or whatever to chew on. Yeah. 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 It would be in jugs. It could be in a cask, a wooden cask, and that kind of thing also. But yeah, this is very much what one of the main uses for pottery vessels at this time was for liquor storage. Yeah. Now, of course, a key development in moving Ohio into a new economic era out of this pioneer era is the installation of canals. And this started happening in the 1820s and 1830s. That's why when we looked at those different periods of economic development, they're pretty much saying in the 1820s, we're entering a new period. And I think that's pretty much because we're getting canals starting to be installed. Canals promoted a big influx of population into Ohio, and also tremendous opening of markets. Much easier to get produce out of Ohio to the eastern markets, and much easier to bring products you wanted from the east to Ohio by way of the canals. But again, this is pretty far off from that time in 1807, 1808 when the Clarkes were getting started. As far as personal and political security goes in the region, again, that's one of those categories we're looking at to think about this idea of the frontier. Conflict with Native Americans in general, as we've already said, was in some ways settled or very much minimized by that Treaty of Greenville in 1795. However, we did have this little skirmish called the War of 1812, right? A good while after 1795. And we should take note that Ohio was a major scene for this confrontation between the United States and Great Britain and Great Britain's Indian allies. This was very much one of the places where this conflict played out. Okay, I see some of my labels have moved around a little bit, but I think they're all still readable. Some of the good news about this conflict in Ohio was that it brought a lot of military activity and a lot of cash into the state, and some sales and business related to the military personnel in the state. So it was kind of a boost, temporary boost for the Ohio economy in this early period. Again, very little of the activity that's listed here for this conflict was occurring down around Marietta, right? It was mostly in the western part of Ohio and up along the lake there. However, a negative impact this conflict had was that it destabilized land values here in Ohio. And we had a lot of land speculation here in Ohio. We had people who, if they could gather up enough cash or credit to do it, were buying up big parcels of land with the idea they were going to hang on to it for a while. And then later, as more settlers came in, they could sell the land and make a nice profit. And the conflict of the War of 1812 destabilized land prices. to the point where some of these land speculators actually went out of business. There were some right here in Marietta. Benjamin Ives Gilman was a prominent early settler here, and he had speculated in a lot of land, and this pretty much ruined him. He went back east after the war here. Now, let's take a real quick look at the general economic framework that was present here, again, around this 1807, 1808 period. When Nathaniel arrived in Marietta, again, we think that's 1807, there were no banks, okay? And there was not much hard currency in circulation either. There wasn't much actual cash, even paper money. But especially not much coinage, hard currency, that was what really had value. And a lot of the coinage that was around was British or Spanish. Very, very little American or US coinage. Yeah, I thought maybe I'd catch your attention with this quote here, perhaps stated a bit over dramatically. This quote, without organization of capital in some form, he's really talking about the formation of banks, a community must remain in comparative barbarism. If you don't have banks, you're really living a barbaric kind of existence. And this economic historian who made that statement in 1912 was asserting that if you don't have banks, then anybody locally who's got extra money to invest and do things with, a lot of that money is just going to leave the area. They're going to send it back east or somewhere where it's safer and where they can make money off their money in other places. It's going to leave the local area. And the other idea he asserted was that the poor, quote unquote, had no way to advance themselves by having a place like a bank where they could take a little bit of money and put it and maybe make a little money on that money, or at least keep it in a safe place, or a place where they could go get a loan or a mortgage, again, to try to advance themselves materially. So those were the ideas he had behind this kind of extreme statement that's quoted here. Now, banks, simply defined, are places that gather together a large sum of capital, a large amount of cash, and then they hire that capital out with interest, right? And so they make money on the money. That's the very basic thing that banks do. Banks, when operating properly, bring stability to an economic setting. They underwrite the value of paper currency. Many of these local banks would issue their own paper currency, which had no value except for what the bank would give you for the paper bills in gold or silver, in coinage. If you could take the bill from the bank, the paper currency bill, and give them a $2 bill, get $2 worth of silver or gold coinage, then that paper currency had value. And of course, banks did provide loans and mortgages and a secure place to keep your money and even to transfer money to other places. Now, 1807, Nathaniel's here, no banks. However, the very first regular bank established in the state of Ohio, and by regular bank, I mean an institution that's pretty much dedicated totally to those banking services that I just mentioned. The first regular bank in Ohio was established here in Marietta in 1808. So just the next year, and this bank opened in February of 1808, the very same month that Nathaniel was opening his pottery here. It was called the Bank of Marietta. It was located in what we call Harmon, on that side of the river. This is the structure that the bank was in, and it's still there. It's still here. Yes, which is a good thing. The vines aren't great for the architecture. It was called the Bank of Marietta, and Rufus Putnam was the president of this bank. Now, and that same year in 1808, there was also a regular bank opened up in Chillicothe also. It's interesting, the safe at this bank consisted of a wooden plank chest made of big, heavy wooden boards, wrapped in iron bars and padlocked. That was the first safe in the first bank in Ohio and also here in Marietta. And this bank was in business until 1843, so it was around several decades. It's interesting, there are records for this bank for 1837. This bank was said to have equity of $101,090. But it had notes in circulation, its own paper currency notes in circulation in a value of 120,000 plus. So it had way more notes out in circulation than it had cash on hand, which suggests to me there was a problem. Now, if they don't have a run on notes, everybody doesn't show up the same day cashing their notes, it might not have been a problem. But indeed, these Western banks, these early banks here, were pretty unstable. They were very lightly regulated. There was very little official governmental regulation or anything. They were often poorly capitalized. They were in a situation where they had a lot more loans and paper currency out there than they had cash on hand. And so generally the whole banking economy here in this early period is very, let's call it wobbly. Now, again, just a few more details that I think are really interesting that we get from these great Woodbridge store records that I think really is a great representation of the early business practices here in the area. And I've listed out some of the statistics that have been developed from these records for transactions with 500 customers between 1802 and 1805. Now, anytime you're conducting business and you're getting paid, somebody's buying something or you're getting paid for something you're selling, especially in this period, cash was always preferred, right? That's always the preferred payment. But again, currency, hard cash was scarce in this period. And payment with currency here, where a total bill was, well, a bill was paid totally with cash, that only occurred with 20% of these transactions. Right? Again, very early, 1802, 1805, only 20% of these bills are being paid entirely with cash. Now, a decade later, records indicate that almost 50% of bills at these stores were being paid fully cash. So that really shows the big change that occurred in the whole economic structure of the region and the availability of cash over just a 10-year period. On the other hand, about 57% of these bills were being paid with some cash, but then with a variety of other methods like credit for labor or bartering with things like skins and furs, or with finished goods like whiskey and cheese, or bartered services like we had blacksmiths and shoemakers coming in to purchase things in the Woodbridge store, and they would make a deal where I'll make you X number of pairs of shoes, and you give me credit for those. Or a blacksmith would make nails or something like that and get credit for that at the store. But one especially interesting method that occurred a lot in that time is the use of simple promissory notes. I mentioned these earlier. They were used to pay about 20% of the bills as much as was being paid in cash. Were being paid with these promissory notes. And these are typically just simple handwritten notes on a piece of paper that more or less say John Doe will pay Bob Smith $6 with some interest by such and such a date. And John Doe would sign it, and Bob Smith would sign it. This was just an agreement that there was this loan of a certain amount of money. You could take a note that showed that somebody owed you $6, bring it to the Woodbridge store and say, I want to use this note to buy some stuff in your store. And Woodbridge might say, okay, that's note is for $6 value. I'll give you $4 credit for that note. And you can buy $4 worth of product in the store here. And then Woodbridge has got the note, the $6 note, which still has to be paid off. And so there's some risk for the store in doing that. There was a lot of, this is a tricky kind of a setup, right? Where people are kind of trusting each other based on these handwritten notes that they're actually going to pay them off. And there was a lot of litigation over debts. We find Nathaniel Clarke in court multiple times over debts. Sometimes debts he owed, sometimes debts he owed them. But this was a very common way for people to try to settle these financial relationships that weren't working out. Okay. Here's a typical example of these promissory notes. Okay, this one's dated 1810. It's for a loan of $3.33 in 1810, and this was down at Belfry. And it was for a loan of $3.33 from Solomon Langdon to Nathaniel Cushing, and it was to be paid with interest. And again, notes like this were just issued informally based on mutual trust. Apparently, Mr. Langdon felt he could trust Mr. Cushing to pay this off. And in fact, Cushing was a prominent settler down there at Belpre. He had served under General Rufus Putnam in the Revolutionary War. He arrived in Marietta in 1788. He was one of the first civilians to arrive, and he was commandant of the Farmer's Castle fortification down at Belpre when it was operating during the quote-unquote Indian Wars. So, he was a very established person in the community. This note, we know because of the notes written on the back of it later. It was paid off 5 years later after it was issued in 1815. It was paid off by Cushing's estate because Cushing had died in 1814. So he got this loan in 1810. 4 years later, it still hadn't been paid off. He died, so the estate ends up paying the note. And it was paid with $1.14 interest. Now think about it. $1.14 interest on $3.33 loan. That's a lot of interest. Yeah. It was over 5 years, which makes it a little more reasonable, but it's still a pretty big proportion of that loan. Yeah. Okay. Just about to the end here. I've mentioned several times this paper currency that got issued, and this is called script. Usually is the way it's referred to, or paper script. The first federal currency from the federal government wasn't issued until the Civil War. So up until that time, any kind of paper currency that was operating was pretty much like this, issued by local banks or state banks, I think, or even businesses or companies would issue script. And again, it was as good as what the company would give you for that piece of paper in terms of gold or silver coinage or that kind of thing. Very unregulated. A lot of this stuff got issued and became worthless, or was almost worthless when it was issued. Again, it's part of this very unregulated, unsecured, again, I'll use the word wobbly, economic environment that was very much a part of this era. So, back to the question of whether the southeastern Ohio region that Nathaniel Clarke encountered when he came here with his family in 1807, was it at a frontier level of development? And given these conditions that we just briefly reviewed, to me, the answer is very much yes. Marietta, even in 1807, even several years after Ohio became a state, is still very much a frontier region. Some other people will argue or debate that decision, that designation, and of course we can continue to have an interesting discussion about that. Okay. Last thing I want to talk to you about, I have another quiz for you. Okay, now I guess that image isn't too bad on the screen there. I want to end with this really neat snapshot of Washington County businesses in 1810. What you're looking at here is a copy of the 1810 Federal Manufacturers Census for Washington County. And this is basically a list, a census of all the businesses in the county. Not just Marietta, in the county for 1810. This is the only 1810 manufacturers census we have for a county in Ohio. It's the only one we have because what we have here is a copy that was made by our venerable local census taker, Paul Fearing. He was the official census taker in Washington County in 1810, and he not only made a copy of the census that he sent to Washington, D.C., but he made his own personal copy and kept it here. And that's at Special Collections, right? That's where I remember going to look at this. Yes. What happened to all those other county copies in D.C.? Well, we get back to that thing called the War of 1812. All those records were burned by the British in D.C. So the other manufacturer censuses for Ohio counties were lost in D.C. This one for Washington County, we're very fortunate to survive because we had a local copy that apparently didn't exist in the other county. And this provides really valuable details about the commercial scene here in Marietta. So here comes your quiz. There. So I'll share a little bit of the data here in my very last slide that we get from that census record. But here's the question. Of the three business types that I've listed here, a distillery, a pottery, and a gristmill, which one do you think was the least profitable kind of business to have in Washington County in 1810? Anybody want? Gristmill? Pottery? Is there, you have a particular reason why you say gristmill? Right, that's true. Yeah, they were creating a product, but with someone else's corn mostly. Yeah, and somebody said pottery. any of these are probably pretty good guesses, although, of course, my comments about liquor being such an important commodity might lead you to think, well, distilleries can be a great business, right? Okay, here's our answer. Taking some of the information that was in that manufacturer's census, I developed through a pretty simple method an average profit for each of the different business types, starting with the highest average profit and going down to the least. And this was simply taking the total annual profits for that business type. And then in this case, we had 2 nail factories. Total annual profits of the 2 nail factories, 2,000. So that's an average profit per nail factory of $1,000, right? Very simple. So you can see here exactly the order of profitability among all these different business types. And actually, and I was a little surprised by this, pottery making comes out pretty good place, right? They're a little above the median there. They're on the they're actually the 4th most profitable kind of business in 1810. And you were right, grist mill is less profitable than potteries or a distillery business on average. Oops, let me get rid of this. There. Yeah, one blacked out on the bottom there. Nail making, very profitable. I think it's not hard to understand that there was a pretty big demand for that kind of a product in that period. A lot of settlement occurring, so a lot of structural construction going on, right? The poor old rope walks down there at the bottom, we got 2 of them then. Now, we had a lot of rope walks here in Marietta. What are they making at these places called rope walks? They're making cordage for ships, for shipping, mostly. And these were completely shut down. They were recording no profits at all in 1810. And again, I think we can blame that good old embargo of 1807 on that, why the rope walks were closed. And the tin plate factory, which we have a person in the audience today whose husband is a tinsmith, and I'm pretty sure he's doing better than these folks were with his tinsmithing business, because that was not, there were 2 of them in Marietta. Okay, sorry we've gone on kind of long here. Whoops. I just want to finish by saying that, the Clarke's early years were a time of unstable financial practices, inadequate currency, frequent recessions, limited markets, again, because transportation wasn't great. Nonetheless, I think it's a real credit to them that they persisted in their craft for many decades and again, managed to stay in business for over 60 years here in the Ohio Valley, even in the face of increasing competition and industrialization. And indeed, I think their story here epitomizes the settler aspiration, the kind of aspiration that many people who came here to settle had to obtain material competency, they called it, to advance materially, and also to experience commercial success. So I thank you very much for your attendance and sticking with me today through all these facts and figures. And thank you very much.